Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Coding Intelligence, Machine Learning, and AI Group Lab from WWDC 2026. A lot of Apple's latest AI story is less about flashy promises and more about the plumbing that makes real apps work. The big themes are portability, privacy, and evaluation. How to swap models without rewriting everything, how to manage tiny versus bigger context windows, and how to test these systems like actual software instead of wishful thinking. There's also a very clear message here that local AI is graduating from demo status. Between on-device agents, MLX scaling across multiple Macs, and tools for UI testing and coding workflows, this is starting to look like a production stack, not a science fair project. One of the more useful ideas here is the language model protocol. In plain English, it gives developers one API surface so they can swap inference backends like MLX, Core AI, Google, or Anthropic without rebuilding the whole feature every time. That matters because model work changes fast, and nobody wants to marry one provider in the first draft of an app. If the protocol abstracts the model interface cleanly, teams can experiment much faster and compare results instead of arguing in circles. It also means custom providers are easier to plug in. If something conforms to the protocol, a Swift package can basically become a plugin for the foundation model's framework, which is a pretty elegant way to keep the door open. The on-device model keeps a 4096 token shared context window in iOS 27, and shared is the key word there. Input and output both eat from the same budget, so a long prompt means less room for the answer, and a long answer means less history survives. When that's too tight, private cloud compute pushes the window up to 32K tokens, so developers get a pretty explicit split. Stay local when you can. Move to PCC when the task just needs more breathing room. That's where dynamic profiles come in. They give developers a declarative way to route work between the system model, PCC, and third-party models with privacy, performance, and cost boundaries spelled out in code instead of living in somebody's head. Apple also lays out two nice mental models for passing work between models. The first is baton pass, where the full conversation history goes to the next model, which is great when context matters most and privacy isn't a concern. The second is phone a friend. In that pattern, each model only sees the current query, not the whole backstory, which is much better for privacy-sensitive flows and feels a lot like tool calling. This is the kind of detail that sounds small until you're building something agentic and suddenly realize context sharing is also data sharing. Then it becomes very important, very quickly. Because those token limits are real. Apple ships context management utilities too. Developers can count tokens, summarize long histories, and even drop tool call entries when they need to trim the conversation down. The summarization itself is configurable, so you can choose something more verbose or more concise and decide how often compression should happen. That's useful because there's no universal right answer here. Some apps need rich memory, others just need the essentials. There's a similar token budget lesson in coding agents. Agents can read project source files and an agents.md style guide to imitate a developer's conventions. But that guide still costs tokens, so referencing external files is smarter than dumping a whole manifesto into context. Maybe the strongest philosophy running through all of this is evaluation first. Apple's pitch is that you should start with an eval suite that defines the behavior you want, the edge cases you care about, and the headroom you still need before you build too much on top. The Model Judge Evaluator is part of that. Developers can configure automatic scoring on custom quality dimensions, and then A/B test different dynamic profiles, context strategies, or model backends to see the trade-offs in latency versus accuracy. That's refreshingly adult. Honestly, AI development has had way too much of the "it felt good" in the demo approach, and this is much closer to normal engineering discipline. The framework also supports synthetic data expansion, incremental testing, and direct comparison of model variants, so evaluation becomes a loop instead of a one-time checkbox. There's also a broader shift here. Local AI is being treated as a production feature. The examples aren't toy prompts. They include on-device agents, foundation models chat, and distributed inference with MLX. The MLX distributed demo is the attention grabber. Running trillion parameter models across multiple Mac studios is a pretty strong proof point that large-scale inference on local hardware is not some weird lab curiosity anymore. At the same time, Apple is still very Apple about the boundaries. Apps can't directly share a loaded model instance across app sandboxes, even if they use the exact same weights. They can share cached model files on disk within an app group, but each app still pays its own in-memory loading costs. Which is slightly annoying, but also completely predictable if you've ever met a sandbox. On the developer workflow side, the agent story is getting more concrete too. Agents can take in source files plus style guidance and produce code that tracks a team's conventions more closely, which is a lot more useful than generic autocomplete that writes like 3 different people at once. And for testing, agents can control the Xcode simulator directly. They can tap, swipe, inspect accessibility trees, and grab screenshots, then turn that exploration into UI tests. The suggested testing pyramid still holds. Lots of fast unit-style tests, fewer integration tests, and only a small number of UI tests. The agent-generated UI layer is there for the highest-level checks after it explores how the app behaves. A quieter but important detail is how Apple separates refusals from moderation errors. If the model says it can't answer, that's a different condition from a guardrail block, and developers can detect those cases and choose different fallbacks. There's also a setting for what Apple calls permissible content transformations, meant for cases like emotionally charged journal entries. The idea is that the system can avoid filtering the input itself while still refusing disallowed outputs. That distinction matters because it gives developers finer control over sensitive experiences instead of treating every no as the same no. Taken together, this all feels like Apple trying to make AI development a little less mystical and a lot more operational. Pick the right model, manage context carefully, protect privacy on handoffs, and measure everything. Which, as it turns out, is less cinematic than summoning a superintelligence, but probably much better for shipping apps that actually work. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.